One line from episode 1 completely changed the way I look at the Martians. Not because it explained who they were, because it quietly suggested they never really disappeared. At first, it sounds like another piece of Star Trek lore. Mars had an advanced civilization. Their world was devastated. Their planet became the lifeless red world we've always known. Case closed. Except that's not actually what the episode tells us. Buried beneath everything happening with Pike, the Doldrum War, and the destruction of the fifth planet is a much smaller revelation from Dr. M'Benga. It's so easy to miss because the episode doesn't stop to celebrate it. He discovers similarities between Martian DNA and the genetics of multiple species spread across the galaxy. That's a remarkable thing to say. Not because it confirms where those species came from. It doesn't, but because it opens a door Star Trek has never really opened before. What if the Martians didn't become extinct? What if they became everyone else? The more I sat with that idea, the more I realized it solves several mysteries at once. For years, Mars has mostly existed in Star Trek as a symbol. It's humanity's neighbor, a colony world, sometimes a battlefield, sometimes a place to build ships, but it has never carried the weight of being the birthplace of one of the galaxy's oldest civilizations. Now it does, and once you accept that, another question naturally follows. If the Martians survived, I don't believe M'Benga's discovery is simply world building. I think it's set up, maybe not for the next episode, maybe not even this season, but eventually. Because once the audience knows Martian DNA survived, every unfamiliar species suddenly becomes part of the conversation. Could one of them carry Martian ancestry without knowing it? Could an entire culture have forgotten where it truly came from? We've seen Star Trek explore forgotten origins before. Entire civilizations have built their identities around incomplete histories. Sometimes those histories turn out to be completely wrong. That makes me wonder if Strange New Worlds is planting another mystery that won't pay off immediately. Then there's another detail that deserves more attention. The Martians don't come across as conquerors obsessed with expansion. They're fighting because they're trying to survive. That's an important distinction. They're losing their world. They're under attack. Every decision they make comes from desperation rather than ambition. That changes how we should interpret Commander Cassell. At first glance, she looks like another military leader willing to sacrifice everything to win. But look a little closer. She's carrying the weight of an entire civilization that's running out of time. She's not trying to build an empire. She's trying to make sure her people still have a future. That doesn't justify every choice she makes, but it does make those choices more tragic. And tragedy tends to leave lasting scars. Imagine surviving a disaster that destroys your home planet. Imagine spending generations scattered across unknown worlds. How long before your descendants stop telling that story? How long before it becomes myth instead of memory? Maybe that's exactly what happened here. The descendants of the Martians may have forgotten they were ever Martian. History has a strange way of doing that. It doesn't always disappear. Sometimes it fades, until nobody realizes they're living inside it. There's something else I noticed. Episode 1 spends a surprising amount of time showing us the collapse of one civilization while quietly setting up the rise of another. Everyone has been talking about the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs. That's understandable. It's a huge reveal. But while viewers were focused on Earth's future, the episode quietly asked us to think about Mars' future instead. Those two stories mirror each other. One civilization falls. Another eventually rises. That's been the rhythm of Star Trek since the beginning. Nothing truly disappears. It changes. It evolves. It leaves something behind. Which brings me back to M'Benga's DNA analysis. Science in Star Trek usually serves two purposes. It solves immediate problems, or it plants future revelations. This discovery doesn't solve anything happening in Episode 1. Nobody changes their decisions because of it. Nobody reacts dramatically. The story simply drops the information and moves on. Whenever a script does that, I start paying attention, because it usually means the audience is supposed to remember it later. I don't think the writers included that line just to explain why Mars is empty. I think they included it because they wanted us to start asking a much bigger question. Not, what happened to the Martians? But, where have they been all this time? And if that's the real mystery, then Episode 1 isn't introducing an extinct civilization. It's introducing a hidden legacy that's been quietly woven through Star Trek history all along. That possibility becomes even more interesting when you remember how often Star Trek rewards viewers for noticing connections that seemed insignificant at first. A single line of dialogue can become the foundation for an entire storyline seasons later. A forgotten civilization can suddenly become central to understanding the present. The Martians feel like exactly that kind of setup. Not because we know where their descendants are, we don't, but because the episode goes out of its way to tell us they have descendants at all. That's the part one keep coming back to. The writers didn't have to say it. They chose to. And when a franchise with nearly 60 years of history chooses to rewrite the origins of one of its oldest planets, I don't think it's doing it just to make Episode 1 more exciting. I think it's laying the first stone for a mystery that's much larger than Mars itself. Because if the Martians truly survived, then somewhere in the Star Trek galaxy, their story is still being written. They just may not realize they're the ones writing it. The more I explored this theory, the more one detail kept pulling me back. The episode never says the Martians became one specific race. That's important, because Star Trek has spent decades showing us just how diverse the galaxy really is. If an advanced civilization scattered across countless star systems millions of years ago, evolution alone would make their descendants almost impossible to recognize. Think about humanity for a moment. We're one species living on one planet, yet cultures, languages, and appearances developed in countless different directions. Now imagine that happening across dozens of planets, over 65 million years. Those descendants wouldn't just look different. They'd think differently. They'd build different societies. Some would embrace science. Others would become warriors. Some might never even develop space travel again. After enough time, they wouldn't see themselves as one people anymore. They'd become completely separate civilizations, connected only by something buried deep inside their DNA. And that's exactly what M'Benga seems to be hinting at. Then I started wondering if the writers were quietly answering another question fans have asked for years. Why are so many humanoid species in Star Trek? Humanoid. Yes, the next generation introduced the progenitors, who seeded life across the galaxy. But that doesn't explain every similarity between civilizations that evolved millions of years later. What if the Martians became another piece of that puzzle? Not replacing the progenitors. Building on their work. Imagine an ancient civilization forced to flee its dying world, unknowingly spreading its own genetic legacy everywhere it went. That wouldn't erase existing Star Trek lore. It would expand it. Instead of one ancient influence shaping the galaxy, there were several, each leaving behind its own fingerprints. That's a very Star Trek way of looking at history. Not as one defining event, but as layers built on top of each other. There's also something poetic about Mars becoming the birthplace of a forgotten legacy. For decades, Star Trek has treated Mars as humanity's first great step toward the stars. Shipyards, colonies, exploration. It was always connected to our future. Now Strange New Worlds reaches even further back and suggests Mars had already shaped the galaxy long before humans ever looked up at the night sky. That completely changes its significance. Mars isn't just part of humanity's story anymore. Humanity may simply be the latest civilization living in the shadow of Mars. I don't think that's accidental. Star Trek loves taking familiar places and making them feel ancient again. The best example is Earth itself. Every new series reveals another forgotten chapter, hidden beneath what we thought we knew. Episode 1 feels like it's doing that for Mars. It's taking a planet we've looked at for decades and quietly asking us whether we've misunderstood it all along. Then there's one final detail that I haven't seen many people discuss. The episode doesn't present the Martians as villains. They're desperate. They're flawed. They make terrible choices, but they're also incredibly human. That's interesting because Star Trek usually introduces ancient civilizations as distant, mysterious figures whose motives are difficult to understand. The Martians aren't like that. They're emotional. They're frightened. They're trying to save their people. In other words, they're a lot like us. Maybe that's the point. Maybe Strange New Worlds wants us to see ourselves in them. Not because humans descended from Martians. There's nothing in the episode that supports that. But because civilizations always believe they're permanent, right until they aren't. The Martians probably thought their world would last forever. Then everything changed. Humanity has had that same confidence more than once throughout Star Trek history. And we know how often that confidence gets tested. Maybe Episode 1 isn't really about Mars at all. Maybe it's a warning, a reminder that every great civilization eventually reaches a moment where one decision determines whether its story ends, or simply continues in another form. The Martians lost their planet. But if this theory is correct, they refused to let that be the end of their story. They adapted. They scattered. They survived, not as one united civilization, but as countless fragments carrying pieces of the same past. That's a much more hopeful ending than extinction, and it fits the spirit of Star Trek far better. This franchise has always believed that hope survives even when worlds don't. So when I think back to Episode 1, I don't see the fall of Mars anymore. I see the beginning of one of the oldest mysteries in the Star Trek universe. A mystery hidden inside a single line of dialogue that most viewers probably forgot the moment the episode ended. Maybe that's exactly why the writers buried it there. The biggest reveals in Star Trek rarely arrive with dramatic music or long speeches. Sometimes they're spoken in passing. Then the story moves on, trusting the audience to connect the dots later. I think that's what happened here. Whether this mystery pays off next week or years from now, Episode 1 has already changed the way I'll look at every new species Strange New Worlds introduces, because now I'll be asking a different question. Not, who are they? But, could they be carrying a piece of Mars without even knowing it? If that's what the writers intended, then the Martians didn't disappear when their world died. They became one of Star Trek's oldest hidden legacies, a civilization remembered by no one, but whose descendants may have been quietly shaping the galaxy all along.